The dizzying heights of Nigeria's oil boom in the 1970s created a national addiction to petrodollars, but this reliance would prove to be its undoing. By the early 1980s, the global oil market, which had once seemed like a source of infinite wealth, began to crumble. A worldwide oil glut, caused by decreased demand in Western industrial nations and increased production from other sources, sent prices plummeting. For Nigeria, a country whose national budget and development plans were almost entirely dependent on oil revenues, the crash was catastrophic. The river of money that had flowed into the nation's coffers slowed to a trickle, and the economic engine that had powered a decade of prosperity sputtered and died, leaving the country in a state of shock. The consequences of this economic freefall were immediate and brutal, felt in every corner of Nigerian society. The ambitious government projects that had symbolized the boom, gleaming highways, new universities and sprawling industrial complexes, ground to a halt, many left as unfinished shells that littered the landscape like monuments to a forgotten dream. The government, suddenly facing a massive budget deficit, was forced to implement severe austerity measures. Subsidies were cut, public services were slashed, and a hiring freeze was put in place across the civil service, which had been the country's largest employer. The promise of endless growth had evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of economic contraction and national insolvency. For the Nigerian people, the dream turned into a nightmare almost overnight. The once abundant jobs that had drawn millions to the cities simply vanished. Mass layoffs became a daily occurrence as businesses, both public and private, struggled to stay afloat in the new harsh economic climate. Inflation, which had been manageable during the boom, skyrocketed as the value of the naira collapsed. The price of essential goods, from rice and bread to petrol and medicine, soared, putting immense pressure on household budgets. Long queues, once a sight associated with struggling nations like Ghana, became a common feature of life in Lagos and other Nigerian cities as people scrambled for scarce commodities. This sudden reversal of fortune created a volatile and toxic social atmosphere. The optimism of the 1970s gave way to a pervasive sense of anger, frustration, and betrayal. Millions of Nigerians who had come to expect a certain level of prosperity now found themselves unemployed and struggling to feed their families. The government of President Shehu Shagari, a civilian administration that had taken power in 1979 after years of military rule, was seen as corrupt, inept, and unable to manage the crisis. As public discontent grew, the pressure mounted on the government to provide answers, and more importantly, to find someone to blame for the nation's spectacular fall from grace. In times of profound national crisis, when a government is unable to provide real solutions, finding a scapegoat becomes a powerful and dangerous political tool. For President Shehu Shagari's embattled administration, the target was obvious and vulnerable: the large population of foreign workers within Nigeria's borders. It was a classic diversionary tactic. Instead of addressing the root causes of the economic collapse, overdependence on oil, systemic corruption, and poor economic planning, it was far easier to point a finger at an external group and blame them for stealing jobs, straining public services, and contributing to rising crime rates. The narrative was simple, emotionally resonant, and tragically effective in redirecting public anger away from the failures of the leadership. The media and political rhetoric began to shift dramatically. The same Ghanaian and other West African migrants who had been celebrated as hard-working contributors just a few years earlier were now systematically demonized. They were branded as illegal aliens, a term loaded with negative connotations that stripped them of their humanity and painted them as a parasitic force draining the lifeblood of the nation. Newspapers ran sensationalist headlines, politicians delivered inflammatory speeches, and whispers on the street turned into loud accusations. The narrative claimed that if only these foreigners were gone, the jobs would magically reappear, the economy would recover, and Nigeria's problems would be solved. It was a deeply flawed and cynical argument, but one that resonated with a desperate and frustrated populace. This strategy preyed on the rising xenophobia among ordinary Nigerians who were feeling the economic pinch most acutely. A Nigerian man who had lost his construction job was easily convinced that a Ghanaian mason working down the street was the reason for his unemployment. A family struggling to afford food could be led to believe that the foreign shop owner was hoarding goods or driving up prices. The sentiment that Nigeria is for Nigerians grew louder and more aggressive. The years of peaceful coexistence and shared prosperity were quickly forgotten, erased by a new climate of suspicion, resentment, and hostility. The alien became the face of Nigeria's economic woes, a convenient enemy for a nation in turmoil. The largest and most visible group of these so-called aliens were the Ghanaians. Their sheer numbers, estimated to be over 2 million, made them the primary target of this state-sponsored xenophobia. Their success and integration into Nigerian society now worked against them. They were visible in every sector, from education to manual labor, making them an easy scapegoat. The stage was being meticulously set for a drastic and inhumane solution. The government was preparing to channel the nation's collective rage toward this immigrant community, paving the way for a policy that would have devastating consequences and leave an indelible stain on Nigeria's history and its relationship with its closest neighbor. On January 17, 1983, the Nigerian government made its move. In a stunning and, honestly, pretty cold-hearted announcement, the Minister of Internal Affairs, Alhaji Ali Baba, delivered the executive order that would seal the fate of millions. The directive was blunt and totally uncompromising. All undocumented foreign workers in Nigeria had just 2 weeks until January 31, 1983, to leave the country. For those with professional qualifications, the deadline was extended just a bit, but the message was, well, absolutely clear. The time for hospitality was over. Nigeria was closing its doors, and it was doing so with brutal finality. The order sent a shockwave of panic and disbelief through the vast immigrant communities who had built their lives in the country. This official decree unleashed the fury that had been building up in Nigerian society. The phrase "Ghana must go" transformed from a xenophobic slur into a terrifying government-sanctioned command. It became the rallying cry for a nationwide purge. The military and police were mobilized to enforce the order, conducting aggressive sweeps through neighborhoods known to have large immigrant populations. They went from house to house, from workplace to workplace, demanding to see papers. Those who could not produce the correct documentation on the spot were subjected to intimidation, harassment, and all too often, violence. The rule of law was suspended in favor of mob justice, sanctioned from the highest levels of power. The 2-week deadline created an atmosphere of pure chaos and desperation. It was a logistical impossibility for millions of people to settle their affairs, sell their property, gather their life savings, and arrange transport out of the country in such a short period. Many were forced to abandon their homes and belongings, selling what they could for a pittance to opportunistic locals. Employers withheld final salaries, and landlords refused to return deposits, knowing their tenants had no recourse. Families were torn apart in the pandemonium. People who had lived in Nigeria for over a decade, with children born on Nigerian soil, were suddenly declared illegal and forced to flee with nothing but what they could carry. This is how the famous red, white, and blue checked bag earned its infamous name, the Ghana Must Go bag. It became the symbol of this forced exodus, a cheap but durable vessel into which people frantically stuffed the remnants of their shattered lives. It represented both the haste of their departure and the poverty to which they were being returned. As the deadline approached, the streets of Nigerian cities were filled with the sight of these bags, carried by men, women, and children on a desperate journey towards the borders. The welcoming embrace had fully transformed into a violent shove, pushing millions out into an uncertain and terrifying future.